After weeks of negotiating with an obstinate and capricious president, the House of Representatives passed legislation yesterday raising the debt ceiling and establishing budget caps for the next 2 years. Both Democrats and Republicans compromised in these negotiations, and like every piece of compromise legislation, there are good parts and bad parts of this bill. I want to commend Speaker McCarthy for a number of common sense victories. This bill improves the environmental review process for infrastructure projects. It cuts funding for President Biden's army of IRS agents and saves American taxpayers tens of billions of dollars by clawing back unused COVID funds. Now, the bill doesn't go as far as I might like. It reduces domestic spending to last year's levels, which is better than even more spending and taxes, as the Democrats proposed. But I think domestic spending could return to pre-pandemic levels. COVID emergency legislation was just that, an emergency, compelled by Chinese communist lies. It shouldn't reset the federal government's budget in perpetuity. But again, I sympathize with the Speaker's constraints of a small House majority and negotiating with the Democratic Party that seems to prioritize welfare for grown men who won't work over our military. And as I noted, there are some victories in this bill, and it prevents a default. Unfortunately, this bill poses a mortal risk to our national security by cutting our defense budget, which I cannot support, as grave dangers gather on the horizon. The bill's supporters contend that it raises defense spending by 3.2% compared to last year, and that's true at face value. But inflation was 6% last year. When you get a 3% raise, but prices go up by 6%, even a small child could tell you that your money won't go as far, and your family will have to tighten its belt. And it gets worse next year, when the defense budget will grow by only 1%. Who thinks Joe Biden will get inflation to pre-pandemic levels? And even if he did, inflation would grow at least twice as fast as the defense budget, causing even more real cuts to defense. Worst of all, this bill contains an automatic 1% sequester based off last year's budget. That means that domestic spending will go up and defense spending will go down if the sequester kicks in. Let me repeat that. If the sequester takes effect, Democrats will get more welfare spending while defense gets cut. Who thinks the Democratic leader will be dissatisfied with this result? More to the point, who thinks he won't use the threat of sequester to extort even higher levels of welfare spending? These three provisions, a cut this year in real dollars, a worse cut in real dollars for 2025, and the automatic sequester based on last year's spending bills, conspire to threaten devastating cuts to the defense budget at a time we can least afford it. The bipartisan National Defense Strategy Commission report recommends a real increase to defense spending of between 3% and 5% annually over inflation. This bill would cut real spending by more than 5% in 2 years, effectively slashing tens of billions of dollars from defense. How bad is this defense gap? If we continued our recent bipartisan custom of increasing the defense budget from President Biden's irresponsible budget proposals, we could afford 4 additional Ford-class aircraft carriers, 500 F-35 fighter jets, more than 91,000 Stinger missiles, or 500,000 Javelin anti-tank missiles, all vital to our defense and to the defenses of Ukraine and Taiwan. And while we surrender our lead and erode our military edge, our enemies are catching up. Last year, Russia increased its real military spending over inflation by 1%. China increased its real spending by over 6%, and Iran increased its real spending by over 8%. The United States reduced our real spending by over 3%. And this bill, as I've said, would only make matters worse. For years, Washington has gotten defense spending backwards. The budget shouldn't shape our defense needs. Indeed, it cannot shape our defense needs. Our defense needs have to shape our budget. China doesn't become less aggressive, or Russia less revanchist, or Iran less extreme because our military has shrunk. In fact, the opposite is true. they grow more ambitious and dangerous. The defense budget should rise and fall with the dangers confronting our nation, and I do not believe those dangers are receding. Who here believes the world is safer or more stable than it was a year ago or 2 years ago? On the contrary, America is in greater danger than at any time in my life. Iran is rushing towards a nuclear bomb. Russia has unleashed the largest European invasion since the Second World War, and China is plotting the conquest of Taiwan. Our military stockpiles are depleted, and our defense supply chains are broken or strained. At the same time, our border defenses have effectively collapsed, and cartel members, criminal aliens, possibly even terrorists are pouring into our country. We need a military to match this perilous moment. After all, protecting the safety and security of our people is our first and most fundamental responsibility. We cannot shortchange the military today without grave risks tomorrow. The weapons we buy this year will be the ones we field in 2027, the time by which China will be at its greatest relative strength compared with the United States, and when war is most likely. I know that holding firm on defense priorities isn't always easy, and as I said, there are parts of this bill that I support, but I cannot support the bill because it does not adequately fund our military given the threats we face. Supporters of the bill contend that the situation isn't as bad as I make it out to be, but their arguments don't hold up under scrutiny. Some have claimed that we could still get more defense funding through a supplemental bill or some other backdoor funding mechanism, but these same hollow promises were made when Congress passed the Budget Control Act of 2011, which devastated our military under President Obama. I ran for the Senate in part to reverse that disaster, and I won't vote for a new disaster with the same promises. And as I've explained, the sequester in this bill actually produces more domestic spending than the bill's core provisions, which encourages irresponsible Democrats to trigger sequester. Others have claimed that we can find efficiencies in the Pentagon to make up the difference. I don't disagree that there's fat to trim in some places in our military, but no serious person thinks that it's enough to make up for tens of billions of dollars in cuts. Moreover, this claim assumes that the Biden administration will put our readiness ahead of social engineering. Color me skeptical on that one when they start looking for efficiencies. Still, other supporters have shrugged and deployed the commonly used but rarely persuasive argument that the bill may be bad, but there's no alternative, and it's too late anyway. But it was and it remains our job to craft an alternative. We hear a lot that things that add votes to these big bills get in, and things that subtract votes don't. Again, we know from recent experience with the last two National Defense Authorization Acts that a higher defense number gets nearly 400 votes in the House and more than 80 votes in the Senate. The first thing that should have been settled in these negotiations was a larger defense budget. Democrats have no argument against that recent history. It's indisputable that increases to Joe Biden's defense budgets garner large bipartisan majorities in the House and the Senate. So why wasn't it the first thing settled? I don't know. But the result is that a Congress with a Republican House and a Democratic Senate has now produced a defense budget worse in real terms than either defense budget produced by a unified Democratic Congress. I cannot vote for that curious result. And if it takes a short-term increase in the debt ceiling to go back to the drawing board, so be it. Before we vote, I would also ask all my fellow senators a simple question. Do you feel more safe or less safe than you did a year ago? If you feel more safe, by all means, vote to slash our defense budget. But if not, and in your heart of hearts you know you don't, join me in demanding that we do what it takes to protect our nation.